So I'm delighted to introduce Jeanette O'Neill, who is the Group Head of Sustainability at QBE Insurance. She's an experienced senior leader in the areas of strategy, transformation, culture, leadership and sustainability. She's worked in Australia, Europe and New Zealand. Her background is strategy and operations. She started with Anderson, worked with PwC in London in the sustainability team, but has also spent a period as Head of Corporate Responsibility at NAB and also working in the energy field. She's now been Group Head of Sustainability at QBE since the last year and is very pleased to have now made sustainability as one of the 7 core strategic pillars at QBE. So welcome, Jeanette.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I thought what I'd do before I get into the SDGs specifically is just talk a little bit about our journey around sustainability more broadly, just explain our framework and our approach, and some of the reasons why we do it, what the benefits are, what our stakeholders are really looking for from ourselves, because I think that's probably a similar journey to what many of you are on. And then I can talk a little bit more about the SDGs. As you might have gathered, my background is very much in the sort of strategy space, consulting, and then sort of working with companies around things like transformation, culture, leadership, and sustainability. I'm not a finance person, so if you ask me technical finance questions, I will chuck it to the audience. But yeah, hopefully we'll get some really good conversation happening. And feel free, if there's some really burning questions based on slides, maybe put your hand up, but otherwise I think we'll keep most of the questions till the end. So this is our framework at QBE. I think many of you are probably fairly familiar with sustainability as a concept, but it can, I think, get confused with it's just about the foundation and volunteering, community investment, or it's all about doing the right thing and reputation and brand. But for me and the work that I've done over the past 20 years and at QBE, it's much broader than that. To me, it's really about understanding what are the macroeconomic trends that are happening around the world and using something like the World Economic Forum's risk register to say, well, what's out there? Is it environment-related, political, technology changes, social changes? What are the things that are happening and how do they impact the sustainability of our organisation? So really taking an outside-in lens and saying, are we prepared for those changes and trends? Where are the risks and opportunities? How are they impacting our customers and our people? And are we responding effectively through our products and services? So it is actually very, very broad because those sort of issues can be quite complex and interrelated, as are the SDGs. So there's sort of 6 lenses to the way that we think about sustainability. The first is sitting around the sustainable insurance space. So how do we think about all of those trends from an ESG risk lens perspective? How do we embed them within our risk frameworks? How do we think about it from a pricing point of view? So not just thinking about, well, what was happening yesterday, but where do we see things shifting, and whether that's climate related or demographics or changes in technology, are we preparing for those sorts of things? I think AI, autonomous vehicles, those sorts of things are really part of the conversation. And then on the flip side of the risk is the opportunity. So how do we think about this from an underwriting perspective? How do we need to build it into our underwriting guidelines and principles? Where are there opportunities to develop new products and services for our customers? So I think that sustainable insurance is a really important part of any approach to sustainability for an insurance company. Responsible investments is all about understanding how we're investing our money as an asset owner. Is there any risk of stranded assets? What's our exposure in terms of sort of meeting the Paris Agreement? And there's other lenses to it again. Also thinking about how do we use our investment dollars for good. So we have our Premiums for Good program where we actually take percentages of premium and invest in social and environmental bonds and impact investing, and really making sure that we're using that money in a way that supports the SDGs. Then we have operational excellence, which is probably where a lot of sustainability began. Sort of 20 years ago, it was about reducing your environmental footprint, thinking about sort of technology, keeping up with technology, cybersecurity. For us as an insurance company, it's also about claims. So do we have the right claims processes in place? And then I think as well around that supply chain management piece. Are we partnering with the right people that have the same values, ethics, agenda that we do? And that's not just through sort of typical supply chain, but through broking and other channel partners. Governance is probably what it says on the tin, and very much part of Royal Commission and everything we've seen over the last year. This is around good conduct. It's around so just not your ethics and code of conduct, around financial crime management, your regulatory management, thinking about bribery and corruption. All of those things are a really important part of governance. And I think modern slavery and sort of thinking about human rights and modern slavery features between the operational excellence and procurement space and this governance space of understanding what we need to be thinking about. Customer and community. We split sustainable insurance and customer and community out because the sustainable insurance is often about the product and the service and the risk advice, but the customer is more about the service that we're providing. Is it transparent? Are we fair? Are we being accessible and inclusive? All of those sorts of elements to customer. It's also thinking about thought leadership and what are the key issues that are impacting the communities in which we operate. How do we think about that impact on our customers? How do we grow our customer base by addressing those community issues and therefore being a company that people want to work with? And then also, I guess, the element of not just that thought leadership and customer focus, but how else do we contribute to the community? Things like through the National Resilience Task Force, thinking about the impacts of severe weather on a community and what our role might be, thinking about how we build relationships with government around policy. All of those sorts of things are wrapped up in here. And then I guess the middle piece is really all about people. You can't deliver any of this if you don't have the right talent. So how do you build the right culture so that people want to work there? How do you retain that talent and develop it so that they're able to deliver your strategy? How do you think about diversity and inclusion? How do you think about workplace sort of health, safety and wellbeing? All of those things are really at the heart of a people-based business, which is what we are. So you can see it's very, very broad. When I go and talk to investors, I can get asked questions on any of this. We're only a small team, so it's not that we manage all of these things. This is the job of the entire 12,000 people at QBE. But my role is really to stand back and articulate that and to be able to talk to an investor or a customer or a regulator and say, this is how we approach sustainability. So maybe a quick show of hands, is this something that you all do within your own organisations? Kind of? Yes? Okay. And so I think as well, as I said, we've been at QBE for just over a year now. So we had this framework in place. We had a coalition of the willing called the Sustainability Committee, and they have really formed and were very passionate and were really driving sustainability within QBE. And I think the premiums for good and the responsible investment space was what was really leading, and I think has had lots of global recognition for its work. But my role was really to then provide the expertise in the background and really start corralling all of this together. I think as well embedding a lot more of that, how do we disclose and embed this in our branding and in our communications. So there's a lot of stuff we were doing that no one realised. And so by having someone like me and my team, we're really able to start driving that through our reporting, embedding it in our annual reporting, developing a sustainability report and actually telling our story. And I think that's been a core part of the last year and sort of improving the recognition of what we've been doing over a number of years. Just quickly on the business benefits, I've probably touched on a few of these already, but that risk management lens is a really core part of thinking about sustainability and, you know, what are those things? How do they impact the business? How do we respond to them? And some of those issues are right now, some of them might be 5-10 years away, so, you know, got that emerging risk lens. But ensuring that we're not too narrow on the way we define risk as just the immediate financial risks. It really is thinking through all of those things that are on the World Economic Forum risk register. And I think this year, 8 of the top 10 are climate or environment related. So really starting to bring that thinking in, that this isn't just sort of the typical financial risk that we might have thought of in the past. The flip side of risk is always that growth and innovation opportunity. How do you think about risk in terms of new products? If you're facing that risk, then so are your customers. So how do you step into that gap and help them? If you do both of those well, then you improve your relationships. If your investors believe that you're managing risk, then they're more likely to invest in you. If your regulators believe that you're managing risk, then they're less likely to regulate you. That then turns into a cost opportunity because if an investor doesn't want to invest in you, then you're driving up the cost of capital. If a regulator's not happy, then you're driving up the cost of regulatory compliance. So all of these things are very, very interconnected. And what I wanted to show is that while there's a reputation and brand benefit to doing this properly, it's actually more of an outcome and not the reason to do it. I think really it is about that understanding your risks and understanding the opportunities as the first lens for thinking about any of this type of work. This diagram, I'll just give you a few examples. So not only are we taking that sort of benefits view, but also understanding the expectations of our stakeholders. So we've done a full materiality process where we look at all the different issues and try and understand how do we benchmark, what are our stakeholders wanting from us, how do they rank some of these issues. But some of the insights that we've really seen over the last couple of years is a real shift in expectations around ESG or sustainability, particularly climate and modern slavery being sort of two really big topics over the last 12 to 18 months, but very much driven by the investors and regulators. So I think a few years ago, a climate conversation probably would have been unusual. Clearly, as insurers, we've been thinking about physical risks and natural disasters and underwriting those. But in terms of climate as a concept, we probably didn't have a lot of investors saying, what are you doing about this? But the Financial Stability Board and the presentation that Mark Carney gave back in 2015 really changed the conversation around climate being a financial risk and part of the financial stability of the globe. That's then really flowed through investor expectations. We've now got the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD recommendations, and a lot more expectation that we are supporting those, implementing those recommendations, and that we can show that through our disclosures. And we're not seeing that just from investors, but from the regulators as well. We had the presentation from the RBA last night, who also confirmed that this is a big part of financial stability. But we've had a number of speeches from Jeff Summerhays over the last few years from APRA. We've seen a huge momentum from Dave Jones, who's the regulator in California. We're now seeing a whole range of shifts with the PRA in the UK. So this is really becoming a very joined up regulatory discussion. But it's not all about climate change. Obviously, the modern slavery legislation came in at the end of last year. And that's only in Australia. It's already in the UK. Canada's looking to adopt something similar, as is Hong Kong. So what does that mean in terms of human rights in the way that we do supply chain management, but also potentially how we do underwriting, which is a lot more complex. So there's a whole range of things that we're seeing coming from that sector. I think customers just want us to help them manage these risks. So there's that, as these risks change, what are we doing to step into that void? And they're also expecting out of the Royal Commission, you know, there's an impact on trust. So how are we building back that trust? You know, do we have the products and services that they need? Are we accessible? Are we affordable? Are we thinking about microinsurance? Those types of things. I've touched on investors. I think community is very similar to customers around that trust element and what's the role of a big corporate compared to government. We're seeing more commercial partners around how do we work together, and one of the key SDGs is at 17, partnerships and collaboration. And then employees, I think we hear a lot of, oh, millennials want to work for a purpose-driven organisation. I think to the most part that's absolutely true, but I don't think it's just about that one generation. There's a whole range of employee trends around that impact why we need to think about this. I mentioned before ageing population, so in terms of flexibility, it's not just sort of young mums that need to take time off. It's about people that need to care for elderly parents. It's all sorts of things that people need flexibility for. It's about understanding the impact of robotics on your workforce and your workforce planning. What is the future going to look like? It's around that mental health, which is becoming a bigger and bigger part of our health and safety at work. So there's a whole range of different things in here as well that we're hearing from that particular stakeholder around what they need from QBE, from an insurance company, from any kind of corporate. So hopefully that just gives you a little bit of a flavour of some of the things that we've been gathering and talking to stakeholders around, and therefore what we need to try and address as an organisation. And then the Sustainable Development Goals. So maybe before I get into the SDGs, is there any questions more broadly on sustainability at QBE? Or I can give you time to think at the end. Yeah. Sorry, I think because, yeah.
Question I would have is clearly it does depend very much on what you're measuring, because as you say, you're a small team, you're leading what the company is doing, but how can you be sure that what's happening at the coalface, when the products are being priced, when they're being sold and that sort of thing, that this thinking is actually part of it? How do you actually go about systematising it and then measuring it?
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good question. So my team is more that kind of coordination, almost like an internal consultant in a way, but all of the owners of these different issues that go across this circle. So we've got a map of about 40 or 50 issues across this. Every single one of those issues has an owner who is accountable to the board and the exec for delivering. So there's diversity inclusion targets and a diversity policy and a diversity strategy. So we go to her and say, what are you doing? How do I capture that? So that goes across tax transparency, product, everything. And my team's role is just to work with them and go, is that real? And then we take that to the group exec and the board and say, this is where we're at, this is how we compare, this is what we want to prioritise. So I think we've been very, very lucky. I think even though it's a new team, I have had so much commitment and engagement from the board and the exec, and I can ring any board member and sit down with them. I have that direct access, which I haven't necessarily had at other organisations. And I feel I've been sending board members to the Cambridge Institute, which is a sustainability leadership program. So there's a NED version and an exec version. So having their support, once they've had a few days of, oh my God, they come back really sort of gunned up looking to help me. So I feel like I've got a lot of momentum in a very short space of time around that sort of ownership and accountability. And a lot of this is also very linked to our culture and our DNA. So we launched a new DNA back in June, July last year. And part of that is outside in, do the right thing, customer focus, and they all link really strongly to achieving this agenda. So I think the other thing that we're doing is starting to set actual targets. What are the key, and some of them are quantitative, some of them are qualitative, but what are we trying to achieve by when? So things like, going carbon neutral, looking at renewable energy, all those sorts of things, through to diversity, through to underwriting, climate change management, etc. So hopefully you'll see more and more as our reporting progresses, that more metric-based reporting as well. Yep. Any other questions at this point? Yep.
You mentioned the business benefits that come out of sustainability. I'm just wondering, do you see sort of the way QBE does sustainability and the way in general sustainability should be done as just a profit maximising way to do business in the current environment, or do you see it more as an opportunity to leverage corporate resources to promote an agenda that has inherent value, but I guess beyond the point of just investing to then get benefits back?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting concept. I think corporate responsibility, when it was really called corporate social responsibility, really started off in that philanthropic, do the right thing, build your brand. It was a cost to the business, but it was seen as nice to do. It had some employee engagement opportunities. And I think that's still a really important part that's not lost as part of this approach. But I think having a very commercial lens on how do we address these issues from a risk point of view, how do we build it into our products, is far more sustainable than a foundation that may grow or shrink depending on your profits each year. So I think having everything, and I think that shared value concept that Michael Porter introduced and Mark Kramer a few years ago, of how do you look for the win-win, how do you address sustainability issues through the products and services you sell, and therefore grow your business, think about innovation, but deal with all of these issues at the same time. And I think like a Unilever or even a Body Shop, when it was right back in its day of, that whole business model was around that. But I think a lot of corporates can look at that and go, well, how do we just embed this in our strategy? And I'll mention later, but I mean, Unilever has taken the SDGs and completely written its business strategy around the achievement of those. And I think they've been a really good example of shared value in these concepts for a number of years now. So I think it's about all of it. If you just do one bit, it's kind of like, oh, that's nice. But if you do it all and you really integrate it into thinking, then it's very powerful. And you do get the very strong profit and shareholder benefits out of it. It's not just the community benefits or the employee gets the feel-good factor. Is that kind of what you were? Yeah. Okay. Any other last questions or? Nope. Okay. So just again, quick show of hands, who's familiar with these? Again, about half. So the UN Sustainable Development Goals were introduced in 2015. Has anyone heard of the Millennium Development Goals? Yeah, so they were around for a while. They were much more focused on developing countries, and then they kind of reached their sort of end date, weren't achieved. And then we replaced them with these. So 193 countries have adopted these. So this is a very UN country-based framework. These goals are very interconnected. So just to sort of highlight a couple, something like no poverty and zero hunger clearly go hand in hand. And when you look at some of the targets under each one of these, they are sometimes repetitive or very interconnected. So you can't really just do one without impacting another one. But it's very much, I think there's 169 targets that sit under these 17, 230 indicators that sit up behind it, which is then a kind of a roadmap to 2030. There's no way that countries will achieve these goals as government alone. It really is dependent on partnerships with corporates, NGOs, a whole range of society. And I think therefore obviously insurance has a key part to play in that. I think a lot of leading corporates have started to think about the SDGs and what role they can play. So even though this is a government thing, corporates are more and more thinking, well, what should I be doing? How can I think about this? And investors are asking the question as well. So they're not necessarily ranking. So they might look at TCFD or diversity inclusion or your code of conduct and actually give you ratings. They're not looking at that from this point of view, but at the same time, if you've got a map of your SDGs and you're showing how you're integrating it, then you kind of get this big silent ticks in the background. I've just met with some of our top investors and they were all very interested in the SDGs for themselves and for their own investment portfolio, and they were all very pleased to see some of the work that we were doing. In terms of, I think it's not just about government needing our help, but actually there's a huge amount of opportunity for companies with the SDGs as well. So there's really a sort of, again, two sides to this coin. I think the SDGs really provide an opportunity for identifying the issues that you might be facing in the communities you operate. There's efficiency opportunities, there's the innovation opportunities once you've identified a problem of how do you start to think about that from your own growth perspective. It enhances regulation and license to operate. I know we're not supposed to use that word after the ASX, but it's still there. And then if you're doing all of that, then again, it helps to attract, you know, whether it's investors, customers, employees, it all becomes, again, part of your brand. And achieving the goals can actually unlock quite a lot of sort of benefit in terms of market opportunity. So the Business and Sustainable Development Commission did a study and they chose 4 kind of economic systems and looked at the opportunity and came up with an estimate of about 12 trillion of market opportunity. So there's a lot of opportunity there to make more profit, but it's just about companies really thinking this through and thinking, well, how would we unlock that? So if we focus on one of those SDGs, where might the benefits be? Is really using it as that lens again of strategic planning and growth and innovation. Obviously, government does need corporate to be involved, particularly the finance sector, because that's where the capital is, and getting access to that capital. And impact investing is a huge part of that, of finding the capital to sort of really go at some of these social and environmental issues. I'd say, looking at a KPMG report, there's actually about 40% of the top 250 companies in the world that already report on SDGs. So while a lot of people are like, never heard of it before, there is quite a big movement globally. I think Australia is probably a bit behind in its awareness. The Australian government's been a bit slower around the SDG mark than others, but it's certainly been very much driven in Europe. New York is a hotbed for the SDGs. There's often big global meetings there. So there is a lot of leadership around this. Sam Mostyn, who many of you may have heard of, who's a very prominent company director in Australia, is also on the National Sustainable Commission that drives this in Australia. Mark Joyner, who's the chair of QBE Australia, is also on that commission. So there's some really great people that are looking at how they support and drive government to sort of implement this. And as I said, I think Unilever are probably the best example of a company that's just gone, right, strategy team, get this right, let's embed this, let's think about this. But Aviva has actually done quite a lot of work around this as well. They're one of the authors of this report that I've quoted from the Sustainable Development Commission, and there's a number of banks and others from the finance sector that have been involved as well. So I definitely recommend having a look at Aviva and seeing what they've done. In terms of just thinking about the SDGs from an insurance lens, clearly there's the access question around how do we provide financial products around that risk and protection, what's our role there, how can we think about the SDGs and maybe think can we expand the roles that we traditionally play, and then again really thinking about financial inclusion. So a lot of the Sustainable Development Goals have an inclusion lens and specifically have targets around the finance sector. So SDG 1 around poverty is very, very big focus on financial inclusion and accessibility, affordability, but a number of the other goals mention it as well, including SDG 8, I think, which is decent work and economic growth. And economic growth relies on people having access to both banking and insurance. The investment lens, as I kind of mentioned through our own approach, is really thinking about responsible investment and protecting, having that credit policy, but also thinking about it from an impact investing point of view. So how do you use the SDG lens to think about your investments? At QBE, we've mapped all of our premiums for good investments against the SDGs, and we have a particular focus on 5, 11 and 13, which I'll talk about a bit more. And then there's just the opportunity for longer term investments, particularly in infrastructure, and that doesn't even have to be from a sustainability mindset point of view, but just thinking about the infrastructure that we need for economic growth. Clearly there's the risk lens, whether that's embedding the risks in our risk frameworks, thinking about influencing customer behaviours through our products and our pricing, and thinking about where we can share non-proprietary information. Obviously, as insurers, we have access to a lot of great information that policyholders or policymakers might need. So how do we sort of, without damaging our sort of commercial information, where is there opportunity for sharing? And then just as from an operations perspective, there's a lot of opportunity to think about the goals. Again, whether that's through our own practices, the governance practices, the modern slavery and human rights issues, diversity, gender equality, all of those sorts of things, of how are they embedded in our policies and procedures. How do we think about our partnerships through brokers, through supply chains, and then how do we step back and think about community investment, and is that being impactful? So if we have a foundation in our organisation, is it just about randomly giving money out, or has it got a really strong strategy that links to the achievement of some of these goals? So lots of opportunity across insurance and the finance sector to think about the SDGs. This is illustrative only. I didn't go and look at every insurance company around the world, but we were just trying to get a sense of where do the insurance companies focus on, because it's very difficult to look at all 17. AXA and Aviva have said all 17 are important, which they are, but then they've bolded a few things that they are more focused on, whereas others have just sort of high level ticked, these are the 3 or 4 that we really want to focus on for the next couple of years. Clear trend around 7 and 13. 7 is affordable and clean energy, and 13 is climate action. So this has probably been a huge topic for the last few years, and that's kind of where a lot of insurers are focused. There is a health angle with SDG 3 if you're a health provider. But yeah, there's a sort of a smattering, but it was useful for us to look at that before we did our own mapping exercise and just get a sense of, are we just completely on the wrong planet with what we want to do? So feel free to look at that in more detail, but it is only illustrative. Again, this is just some examples, and I think you'll get these slides later, so I'm not going to try and talk to them. They're not my examples. There's a report that came out in 2015 from the UN Global Compact that just highlighted some of these. We've added a couple of new ones, but again, then sort of probably not for me to kind of go through in a huge amount of detail, but it is, again, always useful to look at what your peers are doing. I think a lot of the focus is around that no poverty, depending on if you have a personal lines or focus on SME, then really thinking about microinsurance, affordability, accessibility, inclusion, homelessness as issues. Then there's that theme around 7 and 13, which is all that sort of more environment and climate change. And there it's really looking at what are we underwriting, what's the risk exposure in what we're underwriting or investing in, how are we managing that, so that more proactive around our own risk management. But then using vehicles like green bonds and impact investing to sort of influence and help with the capital raising. And then there's also been a very strong focus on renewables through the peers that we've looked at. With decent work and economic growth, I think a lot of that's been focused on the human rights, modern slavery, making sure that our workplaces are fair places and that we help our customers build decent places to work. At QBE, a lot of that is through workers' compensation, rehab services, those sorts of products. And then I think a lot of the social impact activity falls into this one as well. And then lastly, I think the really popular area is SDG 11, which is Sustainable Cities and Communities. Again, thinking about our role in terms of resilience, whether that's preventing climate disasters through our information and sort of in partnership, whether it's after a disaster and what's the support that we provide. So they're the sorts of examples that you're seeing there. As I said, these are a few years old now, but there's lots and lots of new examples. And I'd recommend looking at people's sustainability reports to see what they're up to. So our journey with the SDGs. So we were really keen to have a look at these. As I mentioned, Mark Joyner is the chair of our Australian board, so he's very, very passionate about this. But a number of my global board members as well were like, what are you doing on the SDGs? And I'm like, I've been here a month, just give me some time. So it's been fantastic to have that momentum from my own board members to say, what are you doing? What are you doing? So we spent some time, we actually invited Mark Joyner into a workshop with a number of people from across the business. And he really advised, don't just look at this in terms of a mapping, yep, great, we've done that for 5 years, awesome, move on. He was really focused on what does this risk actually mean for our business, not just where are we sort of helping out in some way. So have that lens of what does this mean for our business, our customers, our people, and then look at what are the products and services that we already provide and how do they contribute. And then once you've done that, stand back and say, and now what could we do in the future? So we really started off last year's process with how does this impact us and how do we contribute? And then that's led into sort of a prioritisation exercise. But now I'm more in that where's the additionality, what else could we do phase. So using that kind of framework, we developed what we thought was the right sort of top 5 for the group as a whole. We're now in 31 countries, so that's a quite high level view, and our regions are very different. So we said, okay, as a hypothesis, these are the 5 that we think we should work on, which is these 5. And then let's actually go to the regional execs and test, is that correct? So once we'd done our global analysis, we then looked at the Australian and Pacific business, and we got access to the customer value proposition, the strategy and business plan. We took all of their information, went through it all, and for every one of the 17 goals, we said, how relevant is this 1 to 4, based on all of the information we had. And we said, actually, we think the 5 we've chosen are the same 5, but let's now sit down for a couple of hours with the executive team of that division and go, are we off our rocker or is this correct? And we did that for every division. So we did that for Asia, we did it for Europe, we did it for US, and we did it for Australia and Pacific. And we ended up agreeing that the 5 that we had chosen were the right 5, but there are nuances between the regions as to what they want to focus on for the future. So gender equality, number 5, and climate action, number 13, are very much group driven. They sort of really need to have a very group focus. We've got a consistent approach around the world, and then we involve different underwriters, investors, members of the team, depending on what we want to achieve. So we felt that those were going to be group driven, whereas 1, no poverty, was very relevant to our Australian business, where we have a lot more personal lines and SMEs. Whereas in our Europe and our North American businesses, we are commercial, so that didn't resonate as strongly. So Australia has chosen number 1 and number 11 to focus on for the next couple of years. Our Asian and European teams focused on number 8 and 11, so more of that economic growth, infrastructure, innovation, all of the decent work stuff that we do around workers' compensation. That was what worked for that particular business. And then in North America, we focus much more on 11, with a bit of 2, which is no hunger under there because we have quite a big crop business in North America. But really addressing the sort of no hunger through sustainable agri and rural communities under 11 rather than pulling it out as a separate one. So that's kind of the work we did to land on the 5. 17 is, as I mentioned before, partnerships. That underpins the whole framework. We didn't pull it out, but it is actually everything. Every single thing we're doing, we're looking at how do we do that in partnership. For the foundation, we wanted to make sure that this was replicated so that the work we're doing in the community is still working to achieve our more strategic goals. The only difference was that health is such a huge part of what our employees want to be involved in through their volunteering and their community giving. So we did add 3 into the mix for the foundation. So our employees can choose to have match giving or ask for grants or be involved in partnerships that are health focused because it is such a huge driver of employee engagement. So that's the only nuance there. And then I guess, so following this exercise, as I mentioned, we're really now looking at what do we want to do. It's not just mapping and going, great, here's some case studies, but really thinking about how this can drive our thinking around our strategy and growth plans. So I'm working with the different regions and their executive teams around, well, how can we start ideating, which is a stupid word, but that seems to be the word at QBE at the moment. So how do we start brainstorming and thinking about new opportunities? And we were hoping to run a huge global staff competition this year to really go out to them and say, if we were to solve customer issues around some particular issues, what might that look like? Is it an underwriting? Is it investment? Is it pricing? Is it a claims opportunity? Where are the opportunities to really think differently? And really using that crowdsourcing and going to the people that have the right skills and not relying on me sort of making stuff up. So that's kind of where we're at, and really starting to think as well about the community investment, the thought leadership piece, and how do we bring all of these things together so it's not just purely on the product side. One of the biggest benefits of talking about sustainable development goals at QBE, a year ago when I started and I had like 2 months to write a sustainability report, and I was like, crap. So I ran out to the business and said, what are we doing on sustainability? And everyone just looked at me and went, I don't know. This year I went out and said, what are we doing on decent work? What are we doing on motor? What are we doing on AI? What are we doing on rehab services? And I got the most amazing case studies and the most fantastic engagement. And all of a sudden people were like, oh, we do this and we do this and we could do this and we could do that. And it's just a completely different conversation. So even if you don't report on it and don't think about it from an external point of view, as an internal tool, it's extremely useful. So I guess that's the journey that we've been on. Obviously quite passionate about it. But hopefully that's given you a good sense of where we're at and that we've gone on a very rapid journey over the last 12 to 18 months. So maybe hand over to more questions. And I hope I haven't talked for too long. Yeah. Stunned silence. Yeah. Just a microphone. Yeah.
Thank you. So Mudit from Deloitte. I have 2 questions. So the first one is on the 17 goals that have been agreed globally.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm not very familiar with these, but could you share what sort of targets do they have? You know, say in 50 years they want to achieve all of these, and what has Australia committed to these?
Yes, so I'm not actually sure what the Australian commitments are. I think there was an Australian update around July last year, so it'd be worth having a look at how they're progressing. So the targets, there's a huge big document that outlines all of the SDGs, and then there's, so that's 2 and then all of the targets underneath, and there's sort of a summary, so I'm happy to send that out with the pack. And just sort of going through them and really thinking about, well, some of these are very governmental, and they need to be achieved through government policy and interactions between regulators, whereas some of them are quite corporate. So I've kind of gone through them and said, well, these are ones that we think we can contribute to. So something like no poverty, and most of the goals are 2030, so it's a 2030 plan. But like the first target is by 2030, eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, currently measured as people living on less than $1 a day. probably not going to do a huge amount of focus on that target for QBE, but then down the track we've got target 1.4. By 2030, ensure that all men and women, in particular the poor and vulnerable, have equal rights to economic resources, including financial access. So clearly there is a role in terms of thinking about microinsurance. So it's sort of really going through these and thinking, is this relevant to me and in what way? And then if it is relevant to me, how do I then contribute to that broader government agenda?
So these are more aspirational guidelines for the world.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these are not going to be achieved by 2030, but it's really trying to get 195 countries to be thinking about how could we. And I think there's a fairly regular conference that happens in New York where they're looking at, well, how are we tracking? And I think each member country that signed up has committed to a certain amount of reporting on its progress. So I know that that one for Australia came out about 6 months ago. Yeah.
And if I may, have another question was around something which one of the participants asked earlier. So investors, you mentioned investors are focusing, asking challenging companies, what are you doing?
Yeah.
What's their primary motivation? Is it social good or is it financial?
Financial risk. Yeah. And that's actually what's exciting about this, is that we've moved beyond the doing the right thing into financial stability. And that makes it more real, and that makes it actually far more achievable. Because you can have a chairman or a CEO that's very socially minded and goes, right, I want to get this done, and everyone gets excited, and then they move on, and then the whole thing collapses and no one talks about it ever again. If it's focused on financial risk, it just becomes embedded in the way you do things. So I've been meeting with investors every year for about 10 years now. 10 years ago, I would say, do you care about ESG? And it was all about the G. So it was like independence of the board, diversity of the board, REM, skill sets, etc., etc. That hasn't changed, but now it's almost a given. They're like, I'm not going to talk about the G because I'm assuming you're doing it. Any other question 10 years ago was probably more around customer, any type of customer issues, any scandals in the works that how are you handling it, how are you managing the fallout. Now, I just actually had a round of investor meetings. The top 2 issues were REM, and which is very topical, and climate. Every single one put climate in their top 2. The other key things that most investors mentioned were, again, conduct following the Royal Commission and the focus on both conduct and customer. They also talked about human capital a lot. So what's your culture? Show me the leading indicators of your culture, because I don't believe that you're going to be able to attract the right talent to deliver this very difficult strategy. So they're using human capital as a sign of, are you really going to deliver financial returns for me or not? Because if you don't have the talent, and if you don't have the culture to attract the talent, so there's a lot of really interesting concepts and targets and metrics that they're looking for. One actually asked me, and it was one of our top 5 investors, said, what's your volunteering rate? And I'm like, oh, no one really cares about that, do they? I mean, it's an internal thing, and he said, no, because if you say that every employee has 1 day off a year to do volunteering and the take-up is 2%, then there's a problem with your culture. So I was like, oh, okay, that's really interesting. So there's a lot of that human capital focus, big focus on diversity and inclusion, as you'd expect. I think there's something like $30 trillion of commercial opportunity that can be unlocked if we had gender balance. So there's a big focus on that and the link to productivity. The emerging risks, I said, well, okay, they're the kind of top things for right now. What's kind of the next 3 to 5 years? It was climate, 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 climate again, but more from we're not just talking physical catastrophes, we're talking the impact on water scarcity, the impact on poverty, the impact on migration and political instability. So how it becomes so complicated and interconnected the worse the problem gets. How are you thinking about that from a risk point of view? So it's like, okay. And the other one was modern slavery. Yeah, big focus on modern slavery.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, cyber was the other big thing, as you'd expect. Yeah. Any other questions?
Thank you. You said you mapped the investments against the SDGs. Can you just maybe describe a bit about the process you went through for that?
Yep.
And if you sort of had a contributing, neutral or positive, or what sort of framework you put across
so we,
the measurement?
I probably don't have it all in front of me, but so the responsible investments team in our group investments team did that work. And I guess each of our, with Premiums for Good, we look at all of the different impact investment opportunities. And I think we've got about 32 different securities at the moment that we use for our Premiums for Good. And then we look at, well, what's the social and environmental or both outcomes of that? And they're kind of categorised under different categories. So we kind of traditionally said, well, it's energy related or it's infrastructure related or it's health related. But we've kind of remapped that against the 17 goals to say it's useful for us internally, but it also helps our customers with their own thinking around where they're having an impact. We're particularly focused on gender equality, sustainable cities, particularly with the housing element, and climate action through the sort of portfolio lens we're taking to impact investing. But we have traditionally had a lot of health focus as well, because that's where a lot of impact investing opportunities have been. Yep. Our sustainability report, which came out 2 weeks ago, has a lot of information on that if you want to have a look. Yeah. Page 24. Yeah. Any other questions on the phone?
You mentioned that you're, I guess, working with a whole heap of different areas in the business and getting some really good ideas. In terms of operationalising those things, you know, such as, I guess, different or new services or products or changes to underwriting or pricing, what sort of time frame are you aiming for to see those changes actually released to the market, just broadly speaking?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, it's iterative. Every single time there's an opportunity, it's really looking at, you know, is that an overnight thing? Is it a 6-month thing? Is it a 3-year thing? So I think what I hope that you'll see is that with each sustainability report, with each annual report, you see progression. We are starting to develop more kind of, here's some specific targets, you know, particularly around climate and operational efficiency and those sorts of things. But I think some of the initiatives will just kind of come as they're ready. And there's no a real ability to say, well, we're going to have 9 new products by the end of this year. But what I'm trying to do is look at each team and then look at the goals that relate to that team and have a conversation. So while the 5 are what we're really focused on, sometimes, like the marine team is clearly going to look at number 14 because it's relevant to them. So what our marine team have actually done in the last few weeks is looked at 14 and said, well, one of the big targets under that is eradicating illegal fishing. The Principles for Sustainable Insurance actually have a statement around, we will eradicate illegal fishing by doing X, Y, Z. So we have agreed to sign that statement and be part of the participating insurance companies supporting PSI and Oceana, which is the NGO. So it's actually, I think our British Marine team signed up about a year ago when I first started, and we worked on that together. And then the CEO of British Marine and I have been talking to each of the divisions, marine teams, and saying, could we do this as well? And what have you learned over the last year around guidelines and underwriting procedures that would need to be embedded to make sure that we can live to this statement? So it's those sorts of things all the time. And some of them are easier than others. But if not part of the Principles for Sustainable Insurance, I recommend that you think about it, because there's so much opportunity at a global level that they're coming up with those ideas, they're coming up with the standards and the opportunities. So it's really leveraging that thought leadership and those that experience and research that they've already done to say, well, how is it relevant to me? How can I embed it? Yeah.
So there's a question from the webinar. You seem to be making great strides in a number of areas. The Royal Commission unearthed examples of shareholders, or at least proxies, employed to address governance issues, arguing that managers should not be focused on anything but essentially short-term shareholder return. Is a shareholder backlash a risk here?
A shareholder backlash around being long-term focused? Is that what it means?
Yes, I believe so. It's asking about the difference between the short-term and long-term.
I think sustainability, there is a long-term view to it, but there's also a very short-term view. So I don't think it's at the expense of thinking about short-term performance. As I said before, it's all about understanding the issues from a short, medium and long-term point of view and addressing them as you see fit. And you do need to prioritise this. So I wouldn't say run out and do all 17 goals or, focus on too many targets or too many initiatives at once. That's why even with 5, we've then drilled down for each division and said, actually, you just focus on those 1 or 2 in terms of new thinking, because you've got to deliver a profit, you've got restructures underway, we're very focused on Brilliant Basics at the moment. So we still need to execute day to day to make sure that we're delivering financial returns, but this is about strengthening financial returns, not sort of doing fun things on the side. So hopefully it's not at the expense. And if it was, we would know straight away.
Actually, one of the interesting innovations from QBE has been this Premiums for Good. Could you talk briefly about that, please?
Yeah, so it's actually an initiative that came through a Shark Tank. So it's an idea that had been germinating in our European business. At a leadership forum, we had a Shark Tank, and this was the winning idea, where we really take part of the premiums and invest that for good. So it either has to have a social or environmental benefit beyond the investment return. We take on all the risk, and then we work through with an advisory group around what are the right projects that we can invest in and that have demonstrated return both from a financial, social or environmental. So as I said before, we've got 32 securities that we are invested in. Our premiums for good at the moment is about 440 million. A few weeks ago, we announced that we really have set an ambition to grow that to $1 billion by 2021, and that's US. So there's a really strong momentum within QBE to really start driving how do we use these investment dollars to drive some of these outcomes. Yeah, so for larger commercial customers, it's up to 25% of their premiums invested. Yeah. Exhausted you?
Actually, I have one actuarial related question.
Okay.
You now employ one of our well-known actuaries, Sharanjit.
Yes.
How do you see actuaries contributing to the sustainability topic?
Yeah, hugely, because they actually understand the products and the pricing and the risks. So as I said, I started about just over a year ago. I've built up my team to support me in this very global, big context. But what I needed was people that had risk skills and climate skills and actuary skills to then drive it into our decision making. So I can't necessarily sit down with an actuary and go, this is how you should make decisions, whereas Sharanjit can, having that actuary background. So we've built a team that sits in risk that reports to our group CRO. And they're really looking at that. How do we take all of these things from a risk lens, embed it into our risk framework, and then how do we work with underwriters in each division around particular risks? And obviously a big focus on climate at the moment, and sort of looking at, well, how much exposure do we have in different portfolios? Let's put a number around that. Is there any actual physical or transitional risk related to that exposure? And then how do we want to manage it? So he's really driving those conversations in the business from a risk lens, and then looking at how do we embed that into the underwriting standards. Whereas, my role is a lot more of that governance, strategy, engagement, external relations, working with investors. So we work side by side. We probably talk to each other every day, but the roles are quite different. And I had a very similar structure at NAB, where I had Rosemary Bissett, whom some of you may have met, who was in the risk team, and then we worked sort of side by side. So I'm delighted to have Sharanjit and his team join. They sort of started in September. So we're really starting to, I think that's the other big shift that we've managed to make in the last year, is really starting to identify where are the resources that we should have and haven't, and putting them in the business. So we've also hired a head of environment to really drive the operational environment side of things, and thinking about, renewable energy, building standards, all of those sorts of things. So thank you for letting me steal, Sharanjit.
Any more questions? Okay, well, with that, I think we'd all like to give our heartfelt thanks to you, Jeanette. Most excellent and interesting presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.